everybody, welcome to my Elden Ring death recap, where I'm going to go over my first 10 deaths in this brilliant game, and then categorize those deaths. This is the first video in a series. I'm hoping to cover my entire playthrough eventually, but the goal is to determine once and for all whether Elden Ring is cheap and unfair, or if it's just a difficult game. Naysayers say FromSoft games are unfair. Well, maybe this video can prove that's an unfair reputation, or maybe it'll prove nothing, who knows. Here's a quick montage of my first 10 deaths. So that's a taste of my first misadventures in the lands between. But how did this all go down? Well, my first death is probably identical to everyone's first death. It's the one to the Grafted Scion. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this one, because it's basically how I expect any Soulsborne game to start, with me getting plastered by an uber tough boss while barely getting any hits in. And I didn't mind because I knew some version of this was going to happen, but I did mind when the Grafted Scion screamed at me and then everything froze as the game awkwardly transitioned into a cutscene. If I'd never played one of these games before, I may have thought this was going to be a sign of the game's quality, but I knew better being a veteran of those prior entries. Plus, spoiler alert, in my 82 hours so far in Elden Ring, this first death was also my worst death. So it's a good thing I put this travesty behind me and moved on. Because after going through an optional tutorial where FromSoft taught me that jumping is possible in their games, that pausing is still impossible in their games, and that they are just giving out boss credentials to anybody who wants them, I emerged into Limgrave, to one of the most beautiful sights in all of gaming. And it was at this point I had a choice. I could follow the advice of this creepy NPC and go straight towards Stormvale Castle, or I could just explore. And as someone who religiously follows map markers and quest objectives in open world games, it was important for me to step out of my comfort zone in Elden Ring, so I just went somewhere randomly. I went left, and I ran into this troll, and desperate to wipe the bad taste of the Grafted Scion fight from my mouth, I attacked him and surprisingly didn't get overwhelmed. Yeah, he stomped the crap out of me for a bit, but other than that, I found I could dodge him pretty easily. That is, until he pulled that sword from his back. After that, I couldn't dodge shit, and he put me down with ease. Luckily, he's entirely optional, and so after respawning, I snuck by him and down to the Limgrave beach. Once there, I got my first real taste of what kinds of mini adventures I'd be having as I explored Elden Ring. I fought some Demi-Humans who were pretty easy, found a merchant and a pitch black cave that I wanted to explore, but not till I had a light source. I also saw some terrifying octopuses that I didn't even consider attacking, because I've long been scarred by video game octopuses ever since Echo the Dolphin. And it was only after exploring all of that that I went and returned back to that original site of grace. And because my pride was now wounded because I couldn't get over my childhood trauma against video game octopuses, I decided to shoot an arrow at another very tough-looking enemy, the Tree Sentinel, knowing full well that he was going to obliterate me. And that's exactly what happened. Clearly, this guy is not intended to be fought without a horse. I only got 1 or 2 hits in, and this led to my second time being absolutely pummeled by a boss in as many attempts, though this one felt legitimate unlike the first one because it didn't have a stupid hanged animation at the end. I much prefer this manic swinging at a dead body over a glitchy transition any day, even though it looks less ferocious and more like he's swatting at a bee that he's trying to kill. But ferocious or not, his peripheral vision is not all that good, so I stuck by him to the Church of Ella. And this is where I discovered this merchant and a smithing table. With this new base camp of sorts, I started exploring the immediate area, fighting some enemies who were more in my weight class. I am proud to say, though, that I had an epic rematch with the troll, where I came out on top by taking the high ground. I also found the statue that emitted a beam of light towards the cliff face, but rather than follow that light, I went up on my own light source, a torch. After all, I had found the coastal caves earlier, and those were pitch black, but I wanted to explore them now. So I went back to the beach, again ignoring my childhood trauma, and instead attacking my defenseless childhood hero. Once my childhood was in absolute shambles, I went back into the coastal cave. With that light in hand, I trudged through various gangs of Demi-Humans who, though dimly lit, are far less terrifying than a well-lit land octopus. Eventually, I ended up in a giant cavern which screamed boss room, but I'm thinking that screaming was just all of these Demi-Humans in here because screaming is all they seem to do. And I'm thinking this screaming gives them a tactical advantage because I could not focus on the right thing here. I kept auto-locking on the little guys, which meant that I couldn't really keep track of what the big chief was doing as he flung himself around me before tearing me up. At least the second chief doesn't activate right away. Having just one chief and a gaggle of little guys means I get a chance to learn. And after making my way through the caves again to the boss, I handled myself much differently. I was laser focused on the chief, ignoring all of the minions. Granted, that's about all the improvement I showed. I didn't really do anything with that focus. I was just next to the Demi-Human chief. I apparently just tried to invade his personal space, and he still made quick work of me. But it's apparent that I learned here. Sure, it would be more aesthetically pleasing if I actually picked up my runes right when I entered the boss arena, or if I showed some aggression with the Demi-Human chief rather than just hovered next to him the entire time like an intern shadowing a doctor. But me being aggressive is a double-sided sword, because sometimes I get too aggressive, like here. So what could have driven me to being in such a state of despair that I would trot my horse right off of a cliff? Well, funny you should ask. I abandoned the fight against the Demi-Human chiefs, and I left the coastal caves, and I walked back down the beach, and I decided to face my fears. I shot an arrow at the land octopus. It very slowly started slithering towards me, and I said, "Fuck no," and I ran. And that's how childhood trauma turns into adult trauma. But that doesn't really answer the question. Here's the rest of the story of how I got to that cliff. I made up for my cowardice by taking out my frustration on some lesser enemies in this pond north of the Church of Ella. I also decided to follow that statue light to the Stormfoot Catacombs, but I basically reactivated my cowardice by reacting to these tiny imps the exact same way I did to the land octopus. To clear my head, I took a nice walk through the woods and cleared out the gatefront ruins. Those ruins were pretty intense. I nearly died to this elite Godric soldier, but nothing was going to keep me from finding this flail, aka my favorite RPG weapon for some reason. But I neither have the appropriate dexterity level or the ability to level up at all. But luckily when I found this site of grace, the girl from the tutorial cutscene showed up with a ton of lore, and she taught me how to level up, and she gave me a horse. And how did I respond to this unexpected bounty? But why? Why would I do this? Well, I took Torrent for a ride and was practicing fighting enemies from horseback, and then I got to this cliff, and I was thinking, I don't know if I'm gonna die if I just ride a horse off of a cliff in this game. Might as well do it when I'm not fighting an enemy and I can just get my runes back easily. Let's do it in a low stakes environment. Like, sometimes you just gotta test these things out. Like, if I were live streaming, I would be terrified if I just was gonna fall out of my chair. What would happen to my audio? But in a low stakes environment like recording a video and then posting it, I can just test these kinds of things out. And this death was only a slight detour. I was heading in this direction anyway because I was riding Torrent back down to the beach. I was going back to the coastal caves. So after respawning, I grabbed my runes and went back down there, pretending that me and this octopus didn't have a very embarrassing encounter just now. Once at the cave, I waded through the Demi-Humans back to the boss fight, and I'm happy to say it does seem like I learned from those first two fights with the Demi-Human chief. After target locking the wrong guys the first time and just trying to bother him to death in the second time, I actually went in really aggressive this third time. I ran right to him and I started wailing on him, and I got him on the defensive. Sure, I was burning through healing potions, but eventually I cornered him against the fog door and I killed the first chief. Sadly, I had no healing left, so it's not all that surprising that the second chief killed me pretty easily. What is surprising is that the strategy that worked so well for me the last time was not a strategy that I revisited, because the next time, instead of aggressively going after that Demi-Human chief, I very meekly tiptoed towards him, which just aggroed everyone in the room. The rest of the fight was just me manically running around in circles trying to avoid certain death until certain death caught up to me. Luckily, I did manage to keep a little bit of my dignity by picking up my runes at the last second. Still, it seems obvious watching the footage from my next death that I wasn't confident in the aggressive strategy because I hung back again. This time to pepper him with fire arrows, which just made the Demi-Human chief all hot and bothered. And so once again, everyone aggroed, and once again, I was slaughtered very efficiently. And with efficiency in mind, but frustrated at my lack of progress, I rushed back through the coastal caves for another fight. But the thing that I love about FromSoft games is that even relatively easy parts that you've not had an issue with before, you still gotta be careful. And me jumping down into this gang of Demi-Humans to cut out having to walk through the side passages is fine, but not if I jump down with my torch out and then mid-fight decide to switch to my shield. That is careless, and before I knew it, I had been swarmed, and so goes my 10th death. Now that I've recapped those deaths, let's categorize them. I've got 4 groups in my head. The first one would be regular deaths. These are just your run-of-the-mill normal deaths where even if you're doing well, sometimes you just die in these games. It's just kind of par for the course. And I'd only consider 2 of those first 10 deaths to be regular deaths. That time I died to the troll after a 2-minute fight, and the one time I actually did well against the Demi-Human chiefs and killed one of them. Those are the only 2 deaths here where I basically had a handle on what was going on, and I just died. Because these games are tough, and even when you're doing well, you're gonna fail a bunch. But should I be failing this badly? Because the next category is curb stomp deaths, and these are the deaths where I get utterly overwhelmed and just massacred. And 6 of my 10 deaths were curb stomp deaths. These games are hard, but this looks unflattering, and not just because of the goddamn hanged animation here, but honestly I don't think this is that bad on my part. It just shows how boss heavy the early portions of Elden Ring can be if you aren't trying to follow the main path. Plus, it looks even better when you consider in these first 4.5 hours of the game, I only died once to an enemy who seemed to be level appropriate for my character. Of course, that one situation is an example of a death that was completely my fault and not really a difficult section of the game. These are the careless deaths. These are the deaths where I'm not paying attention or I'm not minding my surroundings or I'm just doing something stupid. And I had 2 of these here, though the one where I rode Torrent off a cliff doesn't really fit since I did that one on purpose. But whatever, let's get to the cheap deaths and find out which of these deaths were cheap. So that's the closest I can come up with for a cheap death here, because that fall was like half a foot. No way I should have died. But in terms of actual gameplay, this 4.5 hour slice of Elden Ring contained no cheap deaths at all. Really, the entire Limgrave portion before heading through the Stormgate is FromSoft easing you in. If you stick to the main path and sneak by the enemies that are clearly stronger than you, and if you focus on fighting through just the standard enemies, the difficulty curve is actually pretty balanced. The only enemies I even considered might be unfair here would be the Demi-Human chiefs, but I scrapped that after like a second. If you had to fight both of them at once, yeah, having a true duo boss this early on in the game would be cheap, but only one chief activates at a time unless you mess up, and this entire coastal cave section for me is basically a side quest, so I wouldn't classify any of this as unfair. Plus, this isn't even the first optional dungeon boss most people would run into. The Erdtree Burial Watchdog or the Beastman of Fair Missoula are closer to the main path, and those are your more standard mono-a-mono battles. But these guys are for a later video, so for now, thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments what did and didn't work in this video. This is a new video series. It's completely different than my previous ones, and so it's a little bit unpolished, but I am enjoying it, so I'd love to hear from you guys. Also, let me know what your first deaths were. You don't have to go through your top 10 or your first 10, but I'd love to know what you guys died to first. Maybe not the Grafted Scion. I don't need to hear how you guys all had that glitched animation too, but I can't believe I keep bringing up that glitched animation. It's almost like I just can't get